This is the only substantive part of my role today. I'm going to be emceeing throughout the day, but I want to give you a few framing remarks from my perspective about why interactivity, why this theme. I want to start with 3 observations that I don't think any of you will disagree with. The first is that a lot of people at Harvard feel time-starved. The second is that there is information being exchanged rapidly across lots of media, across national boundaries, all the time right now. And the third is that there's a fair amount of uncertainty and volatility in how we think about the future. So those 3 observations I put together, and it underscores and reminds me that the context for our students, our faculty, our academic professional staff is really different and much more complex than when a significant proportion of our curricula and our pedagogies were originally designed. So why interactivity? We chose the theme interactivity because we believe that intentionality, or purposefulness, or self-consciousness, as Drew just said, about teaching and learning decisions is especially important right now. And interactivity is necessary for us to be more intentional. To frame today's exchanges, I'm going to adopt a pedagogical tactic. I'm going to problematize for just a minute. Among the many successes over the past 5 years for teaching and learning at Harvard, there have been many, many successes, and I think we've all seen them. But I think there is also still some especially challenging barriers to systemic improvement. Unlike many of my colleagues, what I don't see as a major challenge anymore is that denigration of teaching relative to research. I don't see very many people here at all who want to do anything badly. Everybody wants to do everything well. By and large, every faculty member I talk with really cares about teaching and learning. They really care about their students. They all see synergies between their research and their teaching. Those feel like the challenges from a period of time ago, not today. The bigger challenges seem to me to be that there's still rarely clear evidence for exactly what the curriculum and pedagogy ought to be for our students, that it's incredibly time-consuming to innovate and to change curricula and pedagogy, and that we're still encumbered by a kind of phantom millstone around our neck about what a Harvard education looks like. The complexity of our community and our context doesn't allow for much rarefied isolation. Most of us are trying to manage many, many inputs, many, many outputs every day. Decision fatigue has become a way of life. And decisions about teaching and learning aren't simple. Whether to call on one person rather than another. Whether to choose that course or another one. Whether to recommend this technology to someone you're working with or another one. Whether or how to change the curriculum for a degree program. Not only are these decisions difficult, they're consequential. They can really have such impact. I mean, I think most of us have had an experience of one interaction with an instructor that has changed our life, or with another student. The content of a course can shape the way we think about history and our place in it. The offering of degrees, or deciding not to offer degrees, can impact the labor market, especially at a place like this one. So recently a friend taught me about a concept from philosophy. Reflective equilibrium. Reflective equilibrium, as I understand it, is a sort of process, a method for reasoning back and forth, testing considerations, until a decision can be made with the clarity of commitment. I like this term because it aligns with an experience I feel of relief and stability when I make a decision with intentionality, with clarity and commitment. So here's my conviction, the conviction of the day that led to the theme for today. With decisions so complex and inherently relational as those involved in teaching and learning, it's impossible to do it, and do it well, and do it intentionally without interactivity. Inter means between and together. Active means engaged or ready to engage, lively, vital. You put them together, And the meaning is acting upon or influencing each other. Acting upon or influencing each other is part of teaching and learning, and it's part of the continuous cycle of improvement of teaching and learning. So today's event was designed in response to a series of interactions we had with about 125 faculty this spring and summer. We hosted them in small groups, and we asked them what their challenges were in teaching and learning here, what would interest them in an event like this one. One thing to note is that there was little interest among them in coming together around topics that were pitched in the language of innovation, or in some of the terms that many of us who are familiar with teaching and learning, research and work are familiar with. So interactivity is not meant today as an oblique reference to active learning. And today's sessions are deliberately designed around forms of interaction that are somewhat traditional and with minimal use of new technologies. We did consistently hear two things: provide practical ideas from other colleagues that are easy to try out, and give us opportunities to engage with one another around big questions of teaching and learning. So the breakout sessions in the program represent the first, a set of ideas for improving instructional practices that come directly from our synthesis of those earlier conversations. The morning and lunch sessions act as bookends to provide two different ways for people to engage with the big picture questions. In the upcoming panel, the goal is to situate our teaching and learning with some facts that take us in a broader scope of time and geography. And in the third and final session of the day, the goal is to discuss opportunities for improving teaching and learning here. We hope that you'll be aware throughout the day of the various forms, but quite fundamental ways that we can act upon or influence each other. Exposition, dialogue, moderated dialogue, modeling of a practice, small group work, large group work, sometimes relatively more in listening mode, sometimes relatively more in contributing mode, and finally, breaking bread and drinking together. Again, this session is meant to pull us outward, to think of the decisions we make in teaching and learning within a context of longer time frames and with a global view, and to recognize how the decisions we make now, as President Faust said, they can continue to have impact in the lives of our students for 30, 40, 50 years. Jack and Rebecca are each going to take about 15 minutes to expose you to some of the ideas in their work, and then I'll facilitate a short dialogue between them. I'll briefly introduce them, and you can find a lot more about them in the speaker bios. So Jack Goldstone, and you can come on up, is a sociologist who studies demography, social movements, long-term social change, and the politics of revolutions. He's a professor of public policy at George Mason and is a commentator for numerous television and news media outlets. Rebecca Winthrop, do you want to stand up so everyone can pick you out? Directs the Center for Universal Education and is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in DC. With her colleagues, she's compiled research and conducted pilots and studies to try to isolate cost-effective, scalable teaching and learning activities that will make the biggest difference for the largest numbers of people, especially for those populations in the world that have the least access to early education. Jack.
Thank you, Erin, and it's a pleasure to be here at my alma mater to have a chance to talk to all of you about changes in the world, a little bit about big picture items. We're living in a world now that has changed so dramatically, and yet many of us don't realize it. I'm not talking about the promise of artificial intelligence or driverless cars. I'm talking about changes that began early in the 20th century and yet have already been transformative. Now, when I talk to my students now, I used to simply say, this is what we know, try to teach them this is the state of knowledge, and this is how we discover things to go beyond that. But now I feel I have to prepare them for living in an entirely different world. And so I ask them, when we study the past, what is it that you think you'd like to retain and preserve? And what is it that you'd like to transform? And when we look to the future, What do we have to prepare and brace ourselves for? And what parts of the future can we still create? To give you just one sense of this change, in the 1940s, very few people lived beyond the age 68. Typically, that's what the retirement system was geared for. So that meant adult life from, say, 20 to 70, 50 years. But now, my children and almost all of your students will very likely live to see their 100th birthday. It's already the case that average life expectancy is approaching 80 and is still growing a year every decade, and with advances already underway, it's very likely that 100 will become a reasonable goal. But that means we'll have seen the years of adult life increase from 50 years to 80 years. That means a 50% increase in people's adult life. You'd think a change of that magnitude would lead us to change the institutions of our society, but we haven't even begun to do so. In fact, most of us haven't even begun how to think about changing those institutions, except at the incremental notion of adding a year or two to age for Social Security. But these are big changes that I want to talk to you about today, and how they will change the world. Now, overall, global population growth is slowing down. The big anxieties about running out of food are probably behind us. We've managed to grow food production faster than population, and most countries now have fertility rates at or below replacement. Nonetheless, there are 4 groups of the population that are still growing very fast. These are the aged population in Africa, the population in so-called fragile states, and the urban population. Since I only have 15 minutes, I'm only going to talk about the first 3, and that will be tough enough. But let's look at the magnitudes here. Now, this is a picture, worth 1,000 words at least, of the projected change in the global population over age 60. As I said, 50 years ago, most people did not make it into their 70s. But now that's normal life expectancy in most of the world, growing very quickly. And particularly in the less developed nations, as I'll show you, particularly in China, the number of elderly people is going to grow very dramatically. So back in 1950, you can see the population age 60 was relatively small. It's been growing recently, but it is just about to go through an explosion. 2010 is a real inflection point. Now, a lot of this we began long ago. That is, in the beginning of the 20th century, the discovery of antibiotics greatly extended the survival of children. Then in the 1950s, 60s, we managed to develop inexpensive, almost universally accessible family planning so that people could have smaller families. And in the last 20 and 30 years, we've made great progress against such killers as cancer, hypertension, stroke, and we now are able to have people survive these events and continue. So these changes have led to people having fewer children, living longer lives, and this is the result. Especially the changes can be seen for the population over age 80. In 1980, in the rich countries, only 1 of every 50 people, hardly noticeable in many ways, was over age 80. But in a few years, it will be 1 in 20. And by 2050, it will be 1 in 10. Now, this is transformative. That is, at no point in human history have we had societies where 1/3 of the population will be over 60, or 10% will be over 80. So these are kind of new frontier conditions. For Japan, the proportions are changing even faster. By 2020, 1 in 11 will be over 80, and by 2050, it will be almost 1 in 6. That's not 1 in 6 over 60, that's 1 in 6 over 80. And about over 1/3 of the population will be over 60. China is changing fastest of all. In China, only 1 out of 100 people were over 80 at the beginning of the century, but it will double to 1 out of 50 by 2020, and will be 1 out of 15 by mid-century. So when people talk about China's economy expanding, becoming dominant in the world, it's going to be the age of China, I'm very skeptical, because this is what I see happening to the age structure in China. The red line, the population 60 and up, is about to skyrocket. The working age population is steadily declining, and by about 2060, they will almost meet. And so China is facing these huge headwinds. And indeed, one of the messages from demography, if we look at Japan as our future, it's very hard to grow an economy in the face of declining workforce and aging population. Capital goes increasingly to support people who are no longer growing in productivity. You have fewer young families forming, buying homes, buying appliances. The over 50 tend to buy fewer new things. It's just really tough. Japan's been doing everything they can to push their economy to grow. It's not doing it. I fear we'll all have to get used to the idea of having to find satisfaction and meaningful life without 3% per year real economic growth. And that's just the way it's going to be. Now, there's an exception to this trend, and that is there's one area in the world that's still growing very, very quickly, and that is sub-Saharan Africa. Families in Africa still express a desire for 4 to 5 children as their ideal family size. Now, partly that's because their governments are not able to provide for their health and elderly support, and so people still rely on their children. Partly it's because they have a long tradition of tribal and clan competition where family ties and family size are great assets. But with the technology to ensure the survival of children and a desire to have 4 or 5 or even 6 children, we're seeing family size stabilize. That is, everywhere else in the world, fertility has declined down to replacement. But in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, family size declined from about 6 or 7 to 4 or 5, and in most countries has now stayed there for the last 20 years. So this is the future of the working age population. And as you can see, in China, it turns down around 2010. India, it turns down a little later. Latin America, too. The USA continues to grow from a low level. But by about 2060, 2070, the working age population in Africa will be as large of that as China and India combined. Now, this graph goes to 2100 because that's what the United Nations is projecting. But the future is still ours to control if we take action. And I don't expect Africa's working age population to shoot up to 2.5 billion, because at that point it would be more than the working age population of the entire rest of the world. But it's going to be large, and already from 2010 to 2040, all the action and growth of the global labor force is going to be in Africa. And the question that really is up to us is whether that labor force is going to be productive or not. Certainly it's up to the population of Africa, but so far they have been focusing, thanks to the influence of global aid agencies, on primary education and literacy. And what these numbers show is there's been success. Primary education enrollments, those numbers over 100%, that means people who are no longer primary age, that is, people who are 12, 15, 18, 20, are still getting primary education. So more than 100% of the appropriate age group is enrolled in primary school. But secondary education lags very badly, and that is a serious gap. So serious because giving women secondary education is the key to lowering their fertility, avoiding early marriage, giving them opportunities for jobs. And secondary education is increasingly the key to the entire African workforce becoming more productive. It's no longer the case that simply an elementary school education allows people to be productive in the global economy. So this is a huge challenge, and the numbers are in some ways staggering. These secondary education numbers are for both sexes, and for women, the numbers, as you can imagine, are even worse. Now, one last word about Africa. Change in Africa is a real challenge. We don't tend to think about Africa in terms of carbon dioxide production because it's not a big contributor today. We worry about China, we worry about India, we worry about the United States. But Africa's footprint is growing. And if you look at the population of Africa and its projected growth, and look at what will happen if they start to consume fossil fuels and produce energy in today's technology at the rate of other nations, the growth of carbon dioxide output in Africa could easily dwarf all of the reductions scheduled for the entire rest of the world. And so we need not only to think about Africa as part of the global future, think about educating the youth, think about its development trajectory, but ask ourselves, how do we develop partnerships? How do we develop awareness for the entire trajectory of growth and development on that continent? Now, there's some good news. I'm going to conclude with a little bit of good thought, and that is research on the relationship between age structure and political change shows a clear relationship. That is, as populations get older, they are less violent. There's less crime, there's less political violence, political transitions are less tumultuous, and they're more likely to retain stable democracy if they achieve it. And most of the world is on a trajectory to increase median age as fertility goes down. But Africa remains the exception. Africa is liable to continue challenging global stability for some time. And indeed, the population of the states in Africa that are looking unstable is going to overtake the population of the rest of the world by about 2040. So when we talk about dealing with problems like terrorism and immigration, the time to start is dealing with some of the fertility and education issues now before we end up in a world where the sheer numbers of people living in unstable states starts to overwhelm us. 6 countries today have 48% of global population today. And yet those 6 countries are only weakly engaged in global governance. China is setting up its own versions of development banks and regional associations because it feels left out of the World Bank, IMF, and other global institutions. NATO, the defense organization that we've been relying on to try and create order in places like North Africa and South Asia, has had difficulty meeting defense spending targets. As the population of Europe gets older, this will only get more difficult. So my argument is we need to think about extending the alliances to younger and democratic countries. How do we integrate Brazil, Australia, Mexico, Indonesia into a broader global alliance to further prosperity, development, and peace? Because if we look at all of the institutions that were developed post-World War II, NATO, United Nations, World Bank, they're losing credibility, they're losing effectiveness. Let me close on the note of a crisis for today, migration. As you know, migration is already transforming politics in Europe and the United States. Why? Because we were unprepared for the scale of immigration from Middle East, Africa, and Asia to the developed world. Well, there was no reason to be unprepared for this. The demographics were quite obvious. Migration is actually, as economists will tell us, a source of benefit. It brings youth and fresh skills. The problem is, without integration, migration undermines the politics, the cohesion, and the culture of both the entering and the host populations. So the US and Europe, I would argue, need to learn to think of immigration as a force for growth, and to remember it's not going to stop. The 6 billion people outside Europe and the US, or 8 billion by 2050, will be looking for a better life. We need to figure out how to manage their aspirations while preserving the quality of life in our own societies as we go into unprecedented aging. I'm going to leave it there. I don't have solutions for all of these issues. I will say this talk is going to become a book next year, by which I hope to have more solutions in print. But I'm going to welcome all of your questions and the discussions to come with Rebecca about how education in particular can be a tool for addressing some of these challenges.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Erin, for inviting me and for having me. I think that was a perfect setup, Jack, actually, to talk about the subject that I've been working on for the last 20 years, which is global education, particularly education in the developing world. What's happening? What should we care about? What should we be worried about? What is positive and exciting? In which direction should we go? So I'm just going to run you through sort of a pointillist experience of global education over the last couple centuries, starting very quickly with this chart, which is just to make a point. that it is actually incredibly recently in human history that the idea of schooling has become something that all children should do, and part of our identities and our experience of childhood. 200 years ago, 2 million kids were in primary school, and now it's about 700 million kids, and that's not just due to population growth. It's about 100 times the spread of population growth. And schooling, the idea of mass education. We've had schooling for a very long, long time in many parts of the globe, but always reserved for the elite. And the idea that mass schooling, mass education, it's something that every kid should do is relatively recent, frankly, in human history, and started in Europe and Prussia and spread to the US and across Europe. But the big jump you see there, starting after World War II, is really because developing countries took on the idea of the human right to education and really owned it. It was pretty common, we heard a lot about Africa, for leaders running for election, or leaders of African countries, if we want to point out Africa, not too long ago, several decades ago, to run on a platform to say, I am going to make sure that half the children in the country, or a third of the children in the country, are going to get to school. And that is, sons of tribal chiefs, etc. And that is no longer anything that is socially acceptable, at least to say, even though some may still do it. And that is really important, and it's a big switch. But all is not rosy. We have done a lot of research around what I'm calling the 100-year gap, which is basically that schooling in developing countries is about 100 years behind that of developed countries. And in some ways it makes sense, because the spread of mass education was a project that started 100 years before in developed countries. But it is also something that we've been able to close the gap a little bit, or pretty successfully, on primary education in the last couple decades. But in terms of completing school, that is actually finishing primary education and going on to secondary education, as well as skills learned, there is still a massive gap. And students in developing countries are on average about 100 years behind. It will take, this is an example here, as you can see, about 85 years for low-income countries to catch up to the sort of educated levels cohort. So this is about completing school attainment levels, working age population that are educated as they would to catch up to the developed country peers. Here's another version of that theme focused on Africa, take to 2111, and to reach for all kids in Africa to finish not secondary, but lower secondary, middle school. And what is the reason for that? Like, what's happening behind that aggregate statistic? Who is it that's so far behind? I think that's something that we should talk about. So here you have, I just want to walk you through what this chart looks like. Nigeria, average years of schooling, you can see on the far left, is about almost 7 years for boys and girls. And it's not the rich kids, so the top 20% socioeconomically of boys and girls that are really far behind. They're actually doing pretty well, even if they live in urban or rural areas. So poverty is a huge determining factor. It's actually the poorest, this bottom band here in pink and yellow, the poorest 20% who live in rural areas, and girls especially. You see at the very end here, I don't know if you guys can see it, there's some dotted lines. There's a measure called education poverty, which is that a measure of 17 to 25-year-olds who have less than 2 years of schooling. And if you are a poor girl, live in a rural community, and happen to be part of an ethnic minority, such as the Hausa in Nigeria, you have on average 3 months of schooling. So that difference, that stark inequality, is actually mirrored. This is not Nigeria is not an exception. This is mirrored across Africa and, frankly, across a large numbers of the developing world, particularly regions like Southwest Asia that are also quite behind. So this is another measure of learning, because it's one thing to get kids into school. We've also found over the last 15 years, there's these things called the Millennium Development Goals, which really did a big push to get kids enrolled in primary school, which is laudable and important, and a lot of policy action and funding action were driven towards that. But frankly, upon reflection, it was probably the wrong goal entirely, because kids got into school, countries looked like they were doing well, but we can tell from a lot of student assessment data that a lot of kids weren't learning once they showed up. There's about 250 million kids around the world, and half of them have been in school for 4 years, who cannot recognize words and are not literate. And if you can't learn to read in the first few years of school, your educational trajectory is severely limited. So again, another sort of depressing statistic about how far behind around the 100-year gap. So that's really about access, completion, learning levels. Another thing, though, that we have to think quite carefully about is this. Even if we could magically, and with smart policies and investment, get all kids into school around sub-Saharan Africa, largely Southwest Asia, where the biggest gaps are, and frankly, the biggest growing populations are, as Jack pointed out, would this get us where we want to be? There's a lot of discussion about skills gaps, new economy, what types of competencies do we need young people to develop to prepare them for the future? I like this slide because it's, information then is much of what our schooling model assumes. How schooling was developed assumes a dearth of information, and that information is scarce, hard to get. You need to seek it out. It remains in a few people's minds and in books locked away in a library. Whereas a reality that's not in every country in the world yet, but fast getting there. And if it's certainly here today in the U.S., it's certainly in urban centers around the developing world. And as mobile phone penetration increases and connectivity increases, it will be very soon be the reality that most young people live in. A massive influx of information. So the idea of sort of learning and retaining knowledge and information will be increasingly less important, as it will be to synthesize and discard information that's not useful, critical analysis, all that types of things. This is really important, particularly when we think about how education prepares young people for the labor market. This is not something I'm going to spend a whole lot of time on, and unfortunately, the light gray is not very helpful for you on the X and Y axes. But the point is that places where shares of jobs have fallen are jobs that require low sort of science, STEM, math skills, and low sort of complex social skills. Where jobs are growing are ones that require higher competencies in those areas. One of the things that we are talking a lot about and thinking a lot about, and I would say the U.S. education, K-12 education system is thinking quite a bit about this, but it's also a conversation happening globally, is this idea of breadth of skills. And that we do really need to reorient our education systems to think about the suite of competencies that are really important for young kids to develop. Academic competencies being critical, but so are a whole range of other sets of competencies, such as flexibility and learning agility and creativity, and empathy, and a whole suite of things. And the learning scientists that we work with and who are on my team at Brookings would always say, be sure to say, Rebecca, be sure to mention it's not an add-on. It's not, because I often when I talk to policymakers, I say, it's academic plus, and that sort of makes sense. But the argument from people who study how children learn is that it's actually these quote-unquote soft skills that certainly employers have been very concerned about for many years, end up being some of the most critical skills of all for how children learn. And in fact, if you can help support those types of competencies, children do much better on academic learning as well. So it's an integrated piece. I have a couple more things to show you. This reinforces the point about the labor market, and it really gets drills down on Jack's framing that if we don't have a breadth of skills for kids and young people now in their educational experiences, they're going to be entering a labor force where their skills and competencies are not preparing them for what jobs are available. And you can see here sort of a massive oversupply in a select, this is sub-Saharan Africa countries, of low-skilled workers, people with low skills, and a big shortage for medium skills. I wanted to take a moment. You're going to have 30 seconds to do this, and you can share with each other to drill in on one of these such skills. Creativity is a skill that a lot of people talk about. It's pretty important for thinking about how do we help ensure that kids tackle the future problems in new ways. Okay, 30 seconds, talk to your partner, answer this question, and we'll do a little poll afterwards. Anybody besides your, starting now. All right, let's hear your best guess. All right, raise your hand if you think 6 similar colored Lego bricks make more than 50 unique combinations. Raise your hand. More than 100. More than 1,000. More than 10,000. More than 50,000. We have like a small quorum right in the middle who are going strong. More than 100,000. A few remaining holdouts here, but most people know. There we go, almost 1 billion. And the good people at the Lego company actually did this. So what a great job they have. So the point is actually, frankly, and here is a measure, a study, it's a common study around creativity that studies divergent thinking, that looks at, how many possible uses would an object have. The point here, as you can see, that, the vast majority, almost 98% of 3-year-olds are creative geniuses, but by the time they get to the ripe old age of 25, only 2% score on the divergent thinking test as creative geniuses. And the point is that actually creativity is not something, it's really something that you unlearn rather than learn. And that is incredibly important. I'm going to skip the next slide here, but and get to this point, which is that I really think the task ahead for us, and it's a lot of the work that we're doing at the Center for Universal Education at Brookings these days, is around this question, is really thinking about a couple of key big pivots. One, how do you dive deep on those kids who don't have access to education, and how do you at the same time reorient education systems so that kids don't unlearn creativity and do develop a breadth of skills. And we are at the moment scanning the globe for education innovations that would have the potential really to leapfrog progress forward towards a breadth of skills. And the good news is that actually a lot of the types of breadth of skills, such as creativity and other skill sets, you don't need to have 4 walls and a roof with a very, very well-trained teacher to actually help cultivate those skills. Same with empathy, same with collaboration, et cetera. So I think there's a whole host of new models, multiple pathways for learning, and a new sort of suite, a new system we need to develop that recognizes the different sets of learning experiences that young people have to really try to meet this big 100-year gap. Thanks so much.
Okay. Can you all hear me? Yeah. No?
You're not on.
Not on?
Hello.
It says it's on.
Yeah.
Am I on? No. Okay. So I definitely don't want to put you on the spot as if you are pedagogical experts. And I know that you're not, at least in the classic sense that I've learned about when I look on the internet at the title futurists. You're not futurists. But I do want to ask you to give your opinions about what you've heard from each other, what you think your own work suggests as implications for this community, Harvard's teaching and learning community, and what we should be thinking about in our work as we think about what you've said. So Rebecca has just spoken. I'll ask you to go first, Jack.
Well, the two things that Rebecca's excellent, really excellent presentation made clear for me, this 100-year gap needs to be shrunk in a hurry. Among other things, if it's not, what will we do with the population of 500 million to 1 billion young people who are not educated in a way that allows them to find productive work? And I don't believe that automation will replace all the jobs. A lot of the critical areas, education itself, healthcare, care of the elderly, design, construction, managing landscapes, all of that is very labor intensive and requires people at least with secondary and some college skills. And then for our population, even the elite population, it's important to make creativity flower, because the challenges we're facing require people to imagine very different futures or put themselves in a different situation and say, how do we solve this problem which no one has seen before? And a particular problem then is, how do you convey effective education to so many people who are in not only lagging, but in a place where they may not have electricity, right? Much less textbooks. So that issue for me is absolutely staggering. How do we overcome that huge gap?
One of the things, does it work? Yeah. One of the things that strikes me, Jack, in your presentation, is that I love the focus on Africa, and that I have found, and I've worked in Africa a lot, but I have found that in the broad discussions around whether it's U.S. education or U.S. economy or a whole host of domestic issues, Africa is not seen as an issue that anyone really needs to look at or care about or pay attention to, and it's kind of for a small group of people who are sort of development specialists or those political economy specialists or demographers. So I mean, because your question was what for all of you, I mean, I think that increasingly we need a global. Every young person, right from kindergarten and right the way through higher education, needs to have a global outlook. And I think what your presentation did so strikingly is to say why you should care not just about Africa, but about what is happening in countries around the world, because it will affect us. We are interconnected, and it will affect us. Perhaps most striking is your chart around population growth in Africa, and then your chart around the heat map showing fragile states in Africa. And and if that's the way you don't want to sort of fearmonger, but if that's the way to grab at least our politicians to start taking Africa really seriously, I think that's really important. But how to think about the rest of the world, not just as keep them out. But also as potential solutions. That's the other thing. Certainly in the education space, when we're doing this map of education innovations, I'm convinced that a number of the innovations that are happening in rural Nigeria for the Hausa girls who have 3 months of schooling are pretty transformative and would have reverse innovation legs to come back to Europe or the US.
So, Jack, you were a sociology student here. You've been a faculty member at multiple institutions. So you have had to make decisions yourself about what courses to take, what kinds of courses to offer. Imagine that you are a faculty member here or an academic professional who's thinking about how to support faculty members. What would you say Harvard needs to do to prepare today's students for 2040?
Well, I think aside from needing a global curriculum, which we all need to be able to find Chad on a map and know where Aleppo is, the real challenge that I see is how to teach content and values in a constructive way. One of the illusions about education is it's a good thing. The more people know, the better. Well, maybe, but what I find going around the world is a lot of people react to education by getting angry. When people in developing countries learn about the history of imperialism, or they learn about the disregard that they are held in by many people in the developed world, or they see the effort that goes into projects that are irrelevant to them, they get angry. And some of that anger goes into trying to build up opposition institutions, and some of it goes into violence. We also have a problem in this country. We want to give fairness and space to all different perspectives. But at the same time, we start to lose respect for truth when that happens. Because we say, no one has a monopoly on truth. That's fair enough. No one's values are always right. That's fair enough. Yet unless we all struggle to find some truth that guides us, we don't have a moral anchor for ourselves. And then we can get drawn into discussions where opinion becomes one is just as good as the other. And our trust in other people is not dependent on them telling us the truth. It's dependent on them presenting an opinion that we share. And that leads to a world of divided politics and dysfunctional outcomes. So I try and worry in my teaching, how do I give people a respect for truth? How do I make them conscious that they're responsible for having values that they can be proud of and live with? And how do they add all that up to a foundation on a global scale of knowledge? Now, fortunately, they're in school a long time, so we have an opportunity to do that. But it is a big menu.
So I'm going to push just a little bit on this. Do your colleagues in your departments share your views enough that you could shape a curriculum that everyone agrees upon?
That's a perpetual problem in education everywhere, right? I understand the Common Core, general education have been in flux here for a while. It's been true everywhere. The idea that we could all agree on a curriculum probably is elusive. What I do think we can agree on is a certain amount of rigor, so that we expect students to come out of the other end of our classes having learned something useful and valuable. And if our colleagues are not achieving that, then we get on their case. And at the same time, we expect them to be organized and prepared when they come into the classroom. And we expect what they teach to somehow, in some way, fit into our overall program curriculum, so that it can be one of those Lego bricks. Yes, there are a billion possible combinations, but you want each course to be worthwhile because it can add into one of those combinations, and not just to be a lost bit of time.
Rebecca, you just came back from how many days at the United Nations General Assembly?
A week.
A week.
Longer than needed to be. But.
So you got to hear from lots of people from lots of different countries. You have a kind of immersion experience in whatever that looks like. I can hardly even imagine it. And here you have this group of instructors and other people who really care about education, who represent one end of the education spectrum that you pointed out. You know, what do you think that we could be doing here? I mean, I was looking at that final picture on your slides of these people with, the children had an iPad. You know, is Harvard X something that could help? Are there things that students here could do or others, faculty could do that would make a difference in this leapfrogging the 100-year gap?
Yeah, excuse me, a lot. I want to give one example. This is an example of the sort of leapfrogging potential. There is a program that was called E-Learning Sudan, and they've since changed their name recently, so I can't quite remember. But it's South Sudan, newest country in the globe, and they are interested in developing their education system 200% of their high school graduates would have to go on to become teachers to get everybody into school. So they need new methods, new models. They cannot build their way out of it, sort of build schools, get teachers into teacher training institutes, place them around, et cetera. That model won't work. So what they did is teamed up with universities and NGOs and offline tablets, developed a curriculum that is very contextually relevant and based in the South Sudanese context for displaced out-of-school populations. A lot of these young people have never been to school, and they put them through a sort of accelerated primary education curriculum. And indeed, these kids learned to read. They learned math actually better than their peers in primary school. And all it took was a really committed, caring adult, one learning facilitator, not a trained teacher, per group. And it took really, really masterful pedagogical engineers, content people who worked with the South Sudanese, who happened to be based in a university in Europe. But that type of partnership, that type of expertise is something that sits here, and there's a million groups out there who are trying to do that. So any ability and encouragement to link up your students, not just with sort of studying other groups, but getting actively involved and testing out their ideas, giving credit for some of that, I think will be very impactful.
If I could add and get us away from Africa for a moment, the other huge growing population is the elderly. And right now, although people are living longer, they're not necessarily healthier. It's still the case that 1 out of every 4 over 80 acquires Alzheimer's or some degree of dementia. But the research is suggesting that keeping minds active can actually help delay the onset of Alzheimer's or even help avoid it. I think we need a lot of research on what type of educational opportunities, whether it's a combination of physical therapy and intellectual activity, or whether it's courses maybe in music, or in art, or in algebra, or in philosophy, or in literature, which, if any of these, for which groups are an enjoyable way to keep the mind stimulated. If we had a pill that would delay Alzheimer's by 10 years, people would pay thousands of dollars for it. But maybe instead of a pill, what people need is some type of educational opportunity that can be delivered effectively and conveniently. But that's a whole area of research on what can be done.
And just to jump off on that, it's a great untapped resource. Much like the youth bulge, could be turned into an incredible benefit or an incredible drain, if not, same the elderly. And it would be very useful to think about that experience, not just as college ×2 for the elderly, but a service learning component. There's great programs across South Asia, across Africa, across Latin America, I can think of, where it is the grandparents in the community that are coming into the schools, they are telling stories, they're mentoring, and there's a huge need for caring adults and different types of educational mentors for our kids. So you can actually flip it and tie it into an activity that would actually give back.
But again, this is a field actually that requires evaluation, right? Because we were learning that MOOCs are not really an effective substitute for four-year college, because the biggest problem in four-year college is getting students to complete it. And the one thing in which MOOCs do very, very badly is completion. So they don't solve that problem. But it may be that the use of technology for non-traditional college groups or non-traditional primary or secondary groups is where we'll get the biggest added value, right? But it requires research and evaluation to see what works.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you both to make us think about the future, and do it in two different ways. One as an extreme pessimist, and one as an extreme optimist. And you can pick your point in future. You can say 5 years, 100 years, whatever makes sense to you. But if you could try to paint a picture for us, given your areas of expertise, what's the future look like at its most positive or its most negative? And if you're willing to engage in a discussion with one another as you provide those views about, what could we do now to push it from the extreme pessimism to the extreme optimism?
Okay, I'll go first. let's start with the glass half full here, the optimistic case. I think that in sort of the most optimistic future, and I'm going to start in an area where I know best, which is around child development and learning systems in education, that there will be multiple pathways for getting an education. There will be multiple people deployed in an ecosystem to support young people to get an education, from grandparents to student mentors to business people. Teachers will certainly still exist. Their role may be very, very different. And there'll be an entire sort of suite of what might now be called alternative certification, but recognition of learning competencies pathways. And I think it's already happening and starting, and it's going to be a massive trend that will take off, that educational official sort of degrees, whether it's a primary school completion certificate, secondary school, college, whatever, will be less and less important for employers. And that basically competencies, abilities, knowledge that will be recognized in different ways will be what signals to communities and employers what kids know. And that's a recipe and an ecosystem to rapidly close the 100-year gap. We cannot close it by replicating the current model that we have. We just cannot build our way out of it. So I would start there in an optimistic frame. I think also we could talk about, a minimum basic salary for all the people who are going to be unemployed, the 2 billion jobs, half of the jobs in the globe are at risk of automation in the coming decades. What are those people going to do? I'm not an economist. They seem to constantly be predicting over the centuries increased leisure time. I don't see it, but hopefully it would be there. The pessimistic view is that actually we keep doing what we're doing now, because the predictions are absolutely frightening. One of the things that I was actively involved in at the UN General Assembly is this very high-level commission on global education. And we did a big report launch, and there was a lot of great commissioners. One of your former presidents, Larry Summers, and a whole bunch of others were on it. And it basically said, if we keep doing what we're doing now in terms of education, by 2030, so that's really a hop, skip, and a jump away. That's less than 15 years away. 800 million young people, though that's half of the youth generation, are not going to have the secondary level skills they need to get a job and be successful in life. That's half of the entire population, and the bulk of them are in those fragile states. And in the poorest countries, 1 in 10. So 9 are going to be equipped in the low-income countries. So 90% of the young people in these low-income countries are really going to be hung out to dry. And that's just a recipe for disaster, not only for them and their lives and their countries, but for all of us around the globe. And so that, to me, just spells doom and gloom like no other.
Well, how do I top that? Again, it gets back to me, it gets back to values. My tech friends in Silicon Valley are confident that whatever they come up with will transform the world for the better. But they're still thinking of people largely as consumers. Where can we target the next great app? And I think we need to think about people in terms of the course of their long, complex lives, and how do we help people make those lives valuable and meaningful? That requires more than just technologies. When I think positively, I think we'll rediscover our love for children and wake up to the fact that we're investing an awful lot of money in baby boomers and future elderly, and we're not really investing much money in the future, either in our kids or in the children growing up elsewhere. And we're going to pay for that in the future if we continue to ignore it. Most other generations actually have invested more heavily in young people than in old people. We are really the first to turn that around. And it's not going to, much as I appreciate it myself, given where I'm heading, it's really not what I want for the future. So in a positive world, we would start investing more in a variety of technologies, new ones. I mean, obviously, one of my messages was the world we're moving into is so different. Simply business as usual will be a disaster. Even if we do want to take care of the elderly, public pension funds are looking at deficits in the trillions of dollars. Partly because 0 and negative interest rates, when you have pension funds that are required to buy bonds to be secure. That was a rule in a day where we don't want pension funds to speculate too much or invest in equities. That's risky. So by law, you have to invest 40% of your assets in bonds. Well, when bond returns are 0.25% or negative, that's a recipe for the destruction of pension funds. But that's what we're doing. We're kind of doing things that we've been doing out of habit and inertia that are very destructive of the future. So if we just continue doing business as usual and let fear drive us and try and shut down migration and try and fan hostility toward change, we'll never be able to make the innovations and the global connections we need to recover. Now, if we're optimistic, if we rediscover the value of children, there's huge potential out there. Africa itself probably has greater genetic diversity than any other region in the world, right? It's got taller people, shorter people, probably also has more imaginative and creative people. But that potential needs to be made real by giving people opportunities. So in an optimistic view, I would say we invest in young people in the developed world, give them opportunities for apprenticeships, jobs, try new technologies and new techniques to bridge that 100-year gap that brings 1 billion new creative young people into the world with an opportunity to offer solutions. Then we can have perhaps a more wonderful life than we dreamed of. But we're not going to be able to do it just by letting my generation continue to putter on.
Do you want to respond to one another? I have a set of questions.
I agree.
But
No, I do want to come back briefly on something that you've emphasized, not so much in your presentation, Jack, but in your comments, and I think it's incredibly important, which is this concept of values. One of the exercises that we did leading up to the United Nations has replaced these Millennium Development Goals with something called the Sustainable Development Goals, which are sort of global goals that all countries sign on to, which is an incredibly political and bureaucratic and hair-brained process. But it was useful, actually, to have the conversation about what do countries care about. And where are they, certainly their leaders, and in fact, this process, I think, is actually a hopeful sign. The process of creating the Sustainable Development Goals was perhaps the most consultative global process I've ever, in the history of humanity probably, I've ever seen. It involved every single country practically on the globe, and not just their governments that were elected, but them and lots of consultations, civil society actors, faith-based groups, I mean, you name it. Everybody had opportunities for input, and they did, and it went on for 4 years. But what we learned is that, or what I found insightful, because I was part of one of the processes for the education goal, was that the global institutions, our multilateral financing institutions, some of the UN agencies who give money to the developing world, kept saying, really what we need to focus on is literacy. That's doable. Let's just, minimum bar. Let's get everybody to read, which is totally understandable and should happen. Everybody else, so all the teachers' unions and the presidents and civil society and youth themselves and across the developing world said, actually, we want global citizenship. That, for us, is the most important thing. Reading is an input into that. Yeah. And so I think there is actually an incredible appetite and, in some ways, an alignment around the importance of global citizenship competencies. And that bodes well for, if we can harness it and figure out what it means, and the hardest part is, frankly, implementing it, that bodes well.
I want to build on that a little bit. Dignity is absolutely crucial for people. That's what they really want at the end of the day. They want to feel proud of who they are. They want to feel their kids can look up to them. And that's hard in this day where we have league tables and rankings and here the most elite institution on the planet, perhaps. We don't want to hold everybody accountable on the same scale. Every institution doesn't have to be competing with Harvard in research. And not everything that Harvard does should be scaled up and generalized to the world. There are a lot of different paths to value creativity. I teach in a large state university now, ranked 200th or something. But I have a lot of students from all over the world who still want to come and learn. And we're still doing important work in our own way. I think that notion that there are many different approaches to success, having skill, having pride, academic research, one set of league tables, that's not the answer. If we try and reproduce this everywhere, we'll run out of resources, we'll run out of time, and we'll make people angry. But if we think of how can we give people the opportunity to be global citizens, to get value in their lives as quickly, as manageably, sustainably as possible, and encourage lots of people to input to that, we have a much better chance of getting there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this session has very purposely been at the macro scale. But let's try to come down to the micro scale just for a moment. Are there any implications in your work for particular pedagogical approaches?
I would say I changed a lot in my career. I would say at the beginning I was concerned to be global and kind of drive away people's Enlightenment values, the Eurocentrism, the notion that what happened with democracy and Europe was somehow superior to what happened elsewhere, and get people to value everyone everywhere. But now I've kind of come back around a little bit and say maybe I went too far that way. And that I really want people in my classes, with whatever materials they have, to say, how is this going to impact people's lives? And is it going to risk causing conflict? If it causes conflict, can we bridge conflict? I do work with natural resources, demography, political institutions, institution building. And so much kind of well-meaning development work has been disastrous. Because people were not aware of local conditions. They didn't work with people in setting local goals and agendas. They didn't take advantage of the strengths that were there already on the landscape. They kind of came in with a template based on what they'd learned here. So that all had to be changed. But the Enlightenment did create certain values for kind of truth, objectivity, as goals. Like I say, it doesn't mean your truth, our truth, but the idea that we want to work toward agreement on something where we can recognize, yes, there's evidence for this, there's not evidence for that. It's important to understand what works, to understand kind of principles behind evaluation, statistics, meaningful change, and not just be taken in by the idea that because we're doing something different, it's better. That's not always the case, and sometimes it's downright dangerous. So I want to encourage all of my students to be creative and think differently, but not give people kind of a license to go off in any direction without being anchored somehow to testing what they're doing and saying, does this really provide the outcome you want? Does this conform to the values that you want other people to have? I kind of go back to that old Kantian notion of, adopt rules that you would want everyone else to live by, and try and imagine that world. That's a harder thing to do than to just teach what you care about. Yeah. But that's where I am now in the classroom.
And do you push your students to do that through dialogue, through papers, through case teaching, through...
Yeah, we use all of those things. The danger, of course, when you have a lot of students and it's hard to get time to teach, hard to talk, you end up, do they know the material? Can they show mastery of the material? Can they do something creative with the material? And that's useful, and we still test for that. But in the course of class, I have all the students talk to each other and get in the habit of defending their own views to their peers and having their peers learn to question them in a respectful but constructive way. And so whether it's through small group interaction, if the class is large, we break into groups for that. If the class is small enough, we just have an interactive portion of every class session to do that. Kind of what I call guided conversation among the students with a faculty member present to kind of set boundaries and probe and push directions a little bit. Very useful.
I'm having a hard time answering this question because I'm not in academia. I spend my time in the policy world. So I'm just reflecting back on my own personal time as a doctoral student. And I did philosophy. So we had a cohort of, 7. We were together for 4 years. It was all dialogical. I guess the thing that I appreciated about my advisors and my department chair was that I was really the black sheep of my cohort. I should have really been in the international comparative department, but I was in the philosophy department because it spoke to me more as a young student. I wanted time to reflect, and I found it more analytical, much to the horror of my father, who thought I was never going to get a job. But they were incredibly supportive of me. I was the only one in my cohort who did anything international. It was continental philosophy applied to fragile states and children's well-being and philosophies of childhood in refugee settings. But they really let me, I felt kind of like the black sheep the entire time, but had to come to a point where I accepted that, yeah, I was a black sheep, and that's okay, and I'm fine with it. And so I don't know, I'm sure you all do that anyways with your students, but for me it was incredibly, incredibly empowering to be different and sort of strike out on a different path, not in terms of what you're talking about, sort of subjective understanding of truth and evidence and things like that. But yeah, I found that incredibly useful and important. And I did find, and I'm sure all of you guys do it in your teaching and working with students, as much sort of peer interaction as possible is incredibly useful, guided, et cetera. So that's not helpful at all. Although I am midway through reading a book called The End of College, which we were just talking about, which I haven't finished, but I do recommend it as a read, because it does, it's thought-provoking in terms of how higher education should be different. And I do think there's probably a lot we haven't tapped out the MOOCs. I mean, there will be new versions of learning experiences through blended learning and technology that has massive implications for how we can learn ourselves as adults, young adults in your students' cases, and how to reach out much farther beyond the walls of this great institution.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.